Hello, and thank you for joining our Teach In for the 21st Century webinars brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I am your host, Annie Cyrus. Please, if you do have any questions, use the Q&A box that you see on your screen, and we will make sure, excuse me, to answer them. And tonight, as you all know, we have a very, very special guest who is one of my personal heroes, extremely knowledgeable, and she is Claire Lopes, the founder and president of Lopes Liberty LLC. Claire, such an honor to have you on tonight.
Thank you so much, Annie, for having me. Very glad to be with you and all of our viewers.
Absolutely, it is my pleasure, and I can promise you, all of us are extremely anxious to hear all of your thoughts on this very important topic. So, floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I do want to thank the Horowitz Freedom Center, Jamie Glazov and all the gang, and of course you too, Annie, for inviting me to present here tonight with you all. It's an honor and it's a privilege. And what I thought I would do is address an aspect of this Wuhan coronavirus that's not often talked about very much, and that is its origins in the Chinese Communist Party's biological weapons program. But before I jump right into that, I wanted to give a little bit of background about the Communist Chinese Party. Xi Jinping, who is the president of the People's Republic of China, the chairman of the Communist Chinese Party, and about 8 other titles besides that, but put all of those things into context, the context of Chinese history, and that's millennia of Chinese history. I think that's important to root it and our discussion tonight there. And then I will get into, yes, the details about China's biological warfare program, and then finish up with some conclusions about where I see us, where I think we are we prepared for what's coming, and a bit of a look ahead. So let's start then. Let's start with the background part of this, the history of China. Now, with the lockdown and bit of extra time on my hands here at home over the last few months, I've been doing a bit of a deep dive into all things China. I've not been, and I am not even now, a China expert. My background was in other places, Russia, the Middle East, Iran. But over these last few months, I have dived into a lot of research and study about China. It's fascinating. And I would begin here with this book right here called Sun's Art of War. This is a book which is really a collection of sayings by Sun Tzu that were recorded around 500 BC or so. And the important thing about this book, which by the way, senior Chinese leadership and many others are very familiar with this. They study this. The important thing to point out about it, although it's 500 BC, and here we are in the year 2020, the importance within the Chinese concept of warfare, of cunning and deceit, the shrewd strategy, all of which to this day are held to be more important than just each warring side's purely military capabilities. So we got to keep that in mind. The next book that I'd actually read some time ago is this one called Unrestricted Warfare. This is a handbook, if you will, about concepts of warfare, but written in 1999 by 2 Chinese colonels in the PLA, People's Liberation Army, translated into English some years later. It is, as I said, a blueprint for warfare. Now, the fact that this is, in fact, a master's thesis by these two Chinese colonels who authored it, and it was the PLA that published that master's thesis and the book itself, which we can find on Amazon.com and other places, means that this is considered to be authoritative. It's official. Now, what I want to point out about this is that, again, just like Sun Tzu, 500 years BC, this manual of warfare, unrestricted warfare, also highlights and emphasizes the importance of the non-kinetic aspects of warfare. And I will just give you a small taste of some of that. This comes from page 123 of the book, the little paperback I just showed you, Unrestricted Warfare, in which, on which page, 123, are listed, oh, I don't know, it's well over 24 types of warfare that the Chinese consider important. Remember, this book, 1999. Just a few items from the list. Atomic warfare, diplomatic warfare, financial, economic warfare, conventional warfare, to be sure, yes, and space warfare, drug warfare, and of note for our topic tonight, biochemical warfare. This is not just about the coronavirus, it is about the full spectrum of modern, highly sophisticated, advanced biological and chemical warfare programs. So, unrestricted warfare. Another work that I would recommend to you, and I found immensely helpful to myself, Michael Pillsbury's 100-Year Marathon. This book was written a few years ago, I think 2015 or so, and it's very useful, or was to me, because it describes how the current today Chinese leadership thinks of themselves and thinks of their place in the world. Obviously, this follows on Sun Tzu and Unrestricted Warfare, but the title, 100-Year Marathon, refers to the 100-year period of time between 1949, when Mao Zedong led the revolution in China, and 2049, at which point the Chinese leadership fully expects and intends to be the hegemon, in Chinese the Ba, the hegemon of the entire world, not just of the region, not just of the Eurasian continent even, no, of the world. And I think it's very important that we understand that that's how they think. They are not thinking of coexistence, peaceful coexistence or any other kind. They are thinking of conquering and dominating the entire world. I will mention one last book that I have just finished reading, and it is the very excellent Bully of Asia by Stephen Mosher. This one, again, I'm glad I kind of read these in this order because it also follows on the concepts of how the Chinese leadership sees themselves in the world. Yes, they are physically located in Asia, Bully of Asia, but the hegemonic designs, as Stephen Mosher recounts in the book, are not just on the region, but again, global domination. All right, one more reference for you, and then we'll dive in here. And that is to good friend and colleague, Steve Coughlin. He is the founder of Unconstrained Analytics. And the website for that is unconstrainedanalytics.com. Excuse me. And we will return to this topic further on in the discussion tonight. But Steve talks about political warfare. In other words, non-kinetic warfare. You see the theme that's developing here in all of these works that I've had the privilege to read. The emphasis is on all kinds of warfare, but Steve in particular focuses on political warfare, something that we here in the West, and certainly the United States, are not very well versed in and not focused on. Never mind that our leadership hardly realizes the full importance of that perhaps as much as 5,000-year history of China that goes into the thinking of the leadership, which is steeped in that history and those tactics and stratagems of warfare. All right, let me move on to one more piece that I think is important to put everything else that's going to follow into context. And that is the secret speech of Qi Haoxian. The speech was given around, I think, 2002 or 2003. It was translated into English in 2005. I believe that is after his death. But the report about it and the full text, English language text of this secret speech may be found at the website of my good friend and brilliant, insightful analyst, Jeff Nyquist. And that would be J.R. Nyquist, N-Y-Q-U-I-S-T, jrnyquist.blog. Now, who was Qi Haoxian? Why is he important? Well, he was the defense minister of China from 1993 until 2003, and also the vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Military Commission. This makes him one of the top officials of the Chinese regime in that period of time. In other words, the top 10. Now, this is a very chilling speech that has been translated, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about here. In it, this official, Qi Haoxian, openly refers to the Communist Party of China's intention to militarily defeat, occupy, and colonize the United States. There are references to the ominous term Lebensraum, which I'm sure is familiar to you all. And what of 330 or so million Americans? Well, according to this official, again, top of the Chinese regime, the Communist Party of China will be using special means. This is a quote from his speech. Special means to clean up America. In other words, to use new bioweapons. Quote from his speech. All right. Now, in the context of this millennia-long history of China, today's Chinese Communist Party is not unique in its belligerence, its determination to conquest, its vision of itself as the Middle Kingdom, or the kingdom under the heavens, the only hegemonic kingdom under the heavens. This is not a unique perspective for this Chinese Communist Party today. It's not even particularly communist, really. I would say it's more like predatory capitalist under a very ruthless central command. But it is liberty-crushing, tyrannical, and aggressive, and it intends to rule the world. Now, back in 2018, so that's about 2 years ago, we know that the PRC's president, Xi Jinping, declared openly that he had begun, quote, a new 30 years war against the United States. We are at war with China right now. The only problem is they know it and we don't. All right, let's dive into the biological weapons program of the People's Republic of China. Now, like the United States and around 180 some other nations, the People's Republic of China is a signatory to the Biological Weapons Convention. That international multilateral treaty entered into force in 1975. We, the United States, were initial signatories, and China signed up in 1984 and remains a signatory to this day. Now, The Biological Weapons Convention prohibits all acquisition, development, production, stockpiling, or transfer of any biological weapons agents or toxins, quote, that have no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. Now, President Richard Nixon ended the United States' own offensive biological warfare program in 1969. That's 3 years before the BWC was opened for signatures. Now, in more recent times, more recent dates, the US government itself has issued reports that indicate the People's Republic of China has systematically violated the Biological Warfare Treaty, the Biological Warfare Convention Treaty. For example, in January of 2001, the Pentagon, Department of Defense, issued a report called Proliferation, Threat, and Response. And it states, quote, China is believed to possess an offensive biological warfare capability based on technology developed prior to its accession to the BWC in 1984, end quote. More recently, just a year ago, in August 2019, the Department of State issued a report called Adherence to and Compliance with Arms Control, Non-Proliferation, and Disarmament Agreements and Commitments. It's very diplomatic in its language, but it does raise clear concerns about whether the People's Republic of China were complying with its BWC commitments. And in that report from the Department of State last year is this quote: the US assesses that China possessed an offensive biological weapons program from the early 1950s to at least the late 1980s. Now note that date, close quote. Note that date, late 1980s. That would put the point of non-compliance for China well past the PRC's 1984 signature on the BWC, Biological Weapons Convention. All right, one more perspective, and this comes from our good allies in Israel. And I want to talk about a former Israeli military intelligence official named Danny Shoham, who writes frequently on topics related to weapons of mass destruction. He holds a doctorate in medical microbiology, and he currently works with the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar Ilan University in Israel. Now, he has focused quite a bit on China's biological warfare program, and in 2015, he authored a study published in the Journal of Defense Studies, and it's called China's Biological Warfare Program, an Integrative Study with Special Reference to Biological Warfare Capabilities. Now, he has, in this study, profiled the Communist Party of China's biological warfare program with special reference to capabilities in its defense and military establishments. Now, I'll note that for rogue regimes, we might call this one, very often the illicit WMD, weapons of mass destruction programs, will be concealed away inside of defense and military establishments. Iran comes to mind, for example. And with his research into this topic and the span of China's biological warfare program, he concluded that Beijing has, quote, 12 facilities affiliated with the defense establishment, plus 30 facilities affiliated with the People's Liberation Army that are involved in research, development, production, testing, or storage of biological weapons, end quote. Now, even with overlap, defense and military, People's Liberation Army establishments, facilities, overlap among those perhaps. Even with that possible overlap, that's still quite a lot of biological warfare facilities inside of China. Now, I want to move into some more specifics here, but first I want to give credit and a real tip of the hat to a fantastic young journalist by the name of Joshua Phillip, who works for the Epoch Times. And on the 7th of April this year, 2020, he put out a documentary video called Tracking Down the Origin of the Wuhan Coronavirus. It's a fantastic video. I think you can still find it probably online. It is, well, I guess about close to or an hour, maybe more, maybe a little more even than an hour long, but worth every minute. Now, a little bit later in April, a few months ago, well, a month ago or so, on the 20th of April, relying to a great extent on Joshua Phillip's documentary, I published an article at the Citizens Commission on National Security called Made in China. Citizens Commission on National Security, as you may know, is a successor group to the original Citizens Commission on Benghazi. And I'm a member, have been a member of both. Well, I relied a lot on Joshua Phillip's video for that article, Made in China, and you can find it at that website, which is ccnationalsecurity.org, ccnationalsecurity.org. Now, from that film, and also many other documents and articles that have appeared in peer-reviewed medical and scientific journals and other places, we know that Chinese researchers have been working on coronaviruses for many years. Now, as you may know, the coronavirus is part of a family, a large family of like or similar viruses. And among these are SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, MERS, Middle East respiratory syndrome, the H1N1 or swine flu, the common influenza, and the common cold. But SARS, MERS, and the swine flu all came out of China too. We know this. Now, the Wuhan Institute of Virology is important for us to focus on. This is an institute for the study of virology under the administration of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. It was first established in 2003 with help from the French government, and that was just after the very awful SARS epidemic outbreak. Now, from 2003 onwards, for many years, there were myriad security concerns with this institute. The French certainly had their concerns about it, and others too. And so the Wuhan Institute of Virology did not become operational at the P4 or BSL4, Biosafety Level 4 level as a laboratory until 2017, meaning it was not yet certified to handle the most deadly pathogens, viruses, and other pathogens in the world until 2017. Now, within the Wuhan Institute of Virology, there is a lab that we need to pay attention to. It's called the Key Laboratory of Special Pathogens and Biosafety. It's of particular concern for a number of reasons. One, it is where the now internationally known researcher Xi Zhengli, sometimes called the Bat Lady, experimented especially with bat coronaviruses with a specific purpose to enhance their capability for transmission across species, meaning from animal to human, to jump from animal reservoirs to humans. Now, during the Obama administration years, the Cabinet Department of Health and Human Services provided a US government grant, lots of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm sorry, not hundreds of millions, I apologize. millions of dollars through the National Institutes of Health, and specifically through the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases within the NIH, headed up by Dr. Anthony Fauci. And the US government grant was to a conglomerate, I guess you would call it, sort of an umbrella organization called the EcoHealth Alliance. Now, the Wuhan Institute of Virology is a member of the EcoHealth Alliance, and it got some of this US government Health and Human Services money. Now, some of those funds were channeled through the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where Xi Jinping, Bat Lady, worked together with American and also other Chinese researchers on things, studies called gain of function. Now, ostensibly, this was to prepare for future virus outbreaks, pandemics. But by October of 2014, HHS was alarmed enough about the direction the studies were going to pause the funding. That's the term, pause the funding. Unfortunately, that funding was later resumed, as I've been able to determine. But even with that pause back in late 2014, the damage was already done, because the work begun with that funding and at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, continued on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, perhaps other places too that we don't know about. Remember how large this BW network is within China. I'm focusing on the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but as we can see from Danny Shoham's studies, it's by far from the only one. Nevertheless, that's where we'll focus. Now, the reason we know that the work continued even after US funding was cut off in 2014 is that a gain of function study and its results were published in the December 2015 issue of Nature Medicine, a peer-reviewed medical science journal. Prominent among the authors of that study were one Ralph S. Barrick, PhD, who is the William, or at least at that time, was the William R. Kennan Jr. Distinguished Professor in the Department of Epidemiology and a professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Bat Lady Xizheng Li also was another of the authors, and there are many others. I mean, it's quite a list of co-authors of this study. Both US and Chinese are listed as joint authors. That study is available online. It is called A SARS-like Cluster of Circulating Bat Coronaviruses Shows Potential for Human Emergence. That's the name of the study. That's how you could look it up online if you wanted to read it. It is in English. Now, that study did not only report on what they found already existing in nature, in this case specifically in bats, but they also showed the results of them, these researchers, actually creating something that did not exist before in nature. Now here's a quote, I think a key quote from the abstract at the beginning of this published study, quote, "We generated and characterized a chimeric virus expressing the spike of bat coronavirus in a mouse-adapted SARS coronavirus backbone," end quote. Now, what that means is that they were using genetic sequences that they had isolated out from bat coronaviruses found in China, in bat populations in China, and they had used mice in laboratory experiments to create this chimera. Chimera means a hybrid, putting something together that had not been together before and may not ever have gone together of its own accord in nature. The results of the study, as published in this paper, are both in vitro, which means in lab petri dishes, and in vivo, and that means using the mice in the laboratory, with these lab experiments, probably using you know, a genetic tool like CRISPR, which you'll of course know as a kind of a little scissors, almost if you will, at the molecular level that can snip and cut genomic sequences out of one place, put it into another, or simply snip it out. But it allows the lab scientists to manipulate genomic sequences at the molecular level. That's what they were doing. And they showed in this study that by recombining genetic sequences, a novel coronavirus could be created that would be able to infect human lung cells in a way that the original SARS virus could not and did not. All right, that is enough of the background on the scientific part of things. After that study, remember that's December 2015, we're now in May of 2020. That Frankenstein monster that they created in the lab, one or more of the labs, perhaps the Wuhan Institute of Virology, perhaps others, it got out. Somehow it got out. I am not yet convinced that it was released on purpose. I tend more at this point to think that it was an accident that that virus got out, but one way or another, it got out. Now, I think, and this is my own analysis, that the Chinese Communist Party panicked, because what did they do right away? They silenced or disappeared doctors who expressed concern about this coronavirus, like the Dr. Li Wenliang, who unfortunately later died of the coronavirus. Labs in China were ordered to destroy coronavirus samples. The Communist Party of China hid the growing outbreak that began in Wuhan, Hubei province. This is a south central province of China. Hid that outbreak from the World Health Organization and the world in general, and then blamed a so-called wet market in Wuhan, which you probably know by now is a place where live and often exotic animals are for sale. But in some, the Chinese Communist Party behaved like the brutal totalitarian regime that it is. Now, here are a few other developments. On the 2nd of January, 2020, earlier this year, the Director General of the Wuhan Institute of Virology issued strict prohibitions against any dissemination about the Wuhan coronavirus. Now, at this point, and according to openly published literature, that coronavirus had already been circulating inside of China for as much as 6 weeks, maybe more, going back to November of 2019, perhaps even further. All right, next, in mid-January or the 7th of February 2020, there are varying dates that I found for this, but mid-January to the beginning of February, a top People's Liberation Army biological warfare expert at the Academy of Military Medical Sciences, the 54-year-old Major General Chen Wei, assumed control of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I think that is what we all ought to be calling a clue. On the 15th of February, 2020, the Lancet Medical Journal published a study that reported on several of the earliest known cases of this coronavirus and showed that those cases had absolutely no connection to the Wuhan wet market. And as I've said, those cases go back to about mid-November 2019. Now, the other thing here is that the Communist Party of China very well knew that the horseshoe bats that they were blaming at the wet market for this outbreak were not even sold at the wet market in Wuhan. In fact, that particular species of bat, the horseshoe bat, are not even found in Hubei province at all, of which Wuhan is the capital city. Rather, the horseshoe bats come from, the closest place they come from is around 900 kilometers away from Hubei province in one or the other of two other provinces in China, Yunnan province and or Zhejiang province. Now someone, perhaps the People's Liberation Army, brought those bats to the Wuhan Virology Institute where they were studied and their genetic sequencing of their coronaviruses were worked on. Now, the other thing that the Communist Party of China lied about was human-to-human transmission, which they very well knew, certainly because of those early cases. Remember, going back to probably late November 2019, they lied about human transmission, human-to-human transmission, right up through the middle of January 2020. And WHO Secretary General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus dutifully and deceitfully repeated this Communist China Party propaganda, fooling or misleading, leading astray the United States and many, many others around the world, and losing us precious, precious weeks of time during which we could have prepared for this outbreak had we known what it really was. That was deliberate, it was deceitful, it was criminal. Now, why were they doing this, the Chinese Communist Party, right up into the middle of January? Well, a couple of things come to mind. On January 15, 2020, this was the important date of the signing of the trade deal with the United States. Now, President Trump, our National Institutes of Health, Centers for Disease Control, our government did not know at that point about the human-to-human transmission. They were aware by that point, mid-January, that a virus was beginning to circulate in Hubei province, certainly in Wuhan city in China, but they did not know that it already had been identified for human-to-human transmission. Well, the signing of the trade deal went ahead, as we know. And the Communist Party of China did not want that spreading coronavirus to do anything to disrupt either that trade deal signing or the Lunar New Year, which was then in progress during those weeks of January. Later in January, 21 to 24 January in 2020, was the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, Switzerland. The Chinese sent a large delegation. President Xi was there, and he gave a speech about the wonderful benefits of globalization with China as the leader, the hegemon, to whom the rest of the world would pay tribute. Well, he didn't say that, but I am. That's his vision. Now, President Trump was also at Davos, but his speech was about the Westphalian nation-state system and why it's worth defending. Well, guess who got the wildest standing ovation, clapping reception to their speech? No, it was not President Trump. During this time in January is when the Communist Party of China also shut down all air traffic out of Hubei province to the rest of China, but allowed it to continue flying to the rest of the world. And this is how a lot of that spread to the rest of the world happened. They knew what they were doing. They were deliberately making sure that if they were going to suffer from this coronavirus, economically, trade, commerce, production, what have you, well, they weren't going to be the only ones to suffer. They were going to make sure the rest of the world suffered along with them. Steve Bannon calls this premeditated murder, and I agree. All right, let's draw some conclusions here, because I do want to make sure we leave some time for questions and answers at the end. Let me circle back to Steve Coughlin, whom I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and a paper that he wrote and is published at his website, the Unconstrained Analytics website. And the name of the paper is Formation of a COVID-19 Red Team. As you probably know, Red Team refers to an investigation team that would look at all aspects of a national security threat, typically from its beginning through means to meet the challenge of whatever national security threat that is. So formation of a COVID-19 Red Team. And here are some of his conclusions, and I draw from others of the authors I've mentioned here tonight too. China is at war with the United States and the world. It is taking advantage of our failure to recognize and respond appropriately to the Communist Chinese Party's hostilities waged at the political warfare level, as Steve Coughlin puts it. Now, whether or not the Communist Chinese Party were ready to release the coronavirus 19, its development in the Communist Chinese Party's network of biological warfare labs was no accident. The release might have been, but its development was not an accident. That was biological warfare in violation of the BWC Biological Warfare Convention. Now, for decades, the Communist Party of China has been on a roll with successive US administrations, but also with academics and advisors who all wanted to believe very badly, that drawing the People's Republic of China into the World Economic System, granting it accession to the World Trade Organization, opening it up to trade and commerce with the world would inevitably lead to Western-style liberal democracy too, inside of China. But that hasn't happened. The Chinese Communist Party's been on a roll as a result. Mercantilist trade policies, currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, infiltration throughout our entire university system, academia, throughout our government, throughout even our labs, as we've talked about some of the university-based laboratories. They've also been on a massive military buildup. Now, all of that per Sun Tzu and per Unrestricted Warfare was intended to kind of fly under the radar, taking advantage of what were sort of derisively called panda huggers, and their inclination to want to believe that China was on an inevitable pathway to Western-style liberal democracy. We just had to try harder, give them some more time. Well, under cover of that kind of misguided goodwill, if you will, towards China, they engaged in all of these malign practices. They wanted to avoid provoking too soon the recognition of what they were doing or any response that might follow. And they were doing pretty well with that for quite a few decades after the Nixon-Kissinger years, opening of China in the 1970s, really up until Donald Trump. Along came Donald Trump. Now, to be fair about this, Donald Trump, as a businessman, long before he came down the escalator and decided to run for the presidency, was talking about China and how China was eating our lunch. He was warning us about China for many years before he threw his hat in the ring to run for president and then was elected in 2016. But once he became president, he began to enact measures and change policy towards China in a way that no president before had done. President Trump enacted tough measures, sanctions, instigated a trade war. And as a result, the Chinese economy right now is deep in debt. Well, so are we, but deep in debt, but in a way different than we are, because the Chinese economy is geared almost singularly to an export model. It doesn't have a strong internal domestic market for what it produces. And the reason for that is that there's no middle class. Yes, many have been lifted out of dire poverty over these last decades. And then there is a small minority, slim slice of the tip-top elite of the Communist Chinese Party and their associates who are fabulously wealthy at the top, but they really don't have a middle class. And without that middle class, you don't have a domestic consumption model, which is why the American economy stands a very good chance of bouncing back once things open up. But the Chinese economy does not. So this is a serious economic weakness that they obviously themselves recognize. Now, I want to cite one other very excellent report that I've just finished reading from this month, May 2020. It is by Greg R. Copley, C-O-P-L-E-Y, and it's called, "Is the U.S. Prepared for War with China?" Now, again, whether or not the release of the coronavirus was deliberate, it did, according to Copley, quote, "provide the trigger point for open offensive operations by the PRC." Now, part of that is because they were, in my opinion, not ready for that release yet. They weren't quite, they didn't have their ducks in line, if you will. Now, according to Censor again, back to Censor, the objective is to win the war before kinetic operations even begin, to set the stage. And this is where the Chinese Communist Party was, I believe, before the release of the coronavirus. But the premature trigger of the release of the virus, I think, necessitated that they speed up, that they advance their strategic plans for seizing strategic advantage from this flow of events. They still didn't want us, the enemy, to see either their own vulnerabilities or even to know that they, the Chinese Communist Party, had discovered our weaknesses. This goes to a kind of a mystical concept within Chinese history called shu. And shu, basically, it's difficult to translate into English, and far be it from me to be any kind of linguist as far as the Chinese language goes, but it does mean something to the effect of seizing the advantage out of the flow of events as those events occur, to gain the advantage to oneself while denying it to the enemy, something like that. Now, what have the Chinese communists been up to? Well, a military buildup for a long time. It is far advanced in, I'm sorry, but a drastic decline over the same period of time, these last decades, in US defense capabilities. For example, the Chinese have developed anti-access area denial weaponry, meaning weaponry designed to keep out, for example, the US 7th Fleet from areas they don't want it in, the South China Sea, the Pacific Ocean. And so they developed things like maneuverable hypersonic missiles, mobile ballistic missiles, never mind the space-based technologies, technical capabilities, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. We could go on. And David Goldman, another China scholar whom I greatly admire, writes about this a lot, including in the summer 2020 edition of the Claremont Review of Books, a very important piece there by him about all of these capabilities that the Chinese have built up and we have allowed to lapse. We have fallen behind in them. Now, because, again, the trigger of what I think is the premature release of this coronavirus into the world, and the world becoming aware of what the Chinese had done, at least in the cover-up period after it was released, the malign behavior, belligerent, aggressive behavior after it was released. at least that much. I think that the People's Republic of China had to advance its hegemony timetable. And so what are we seeing even more of than before? It's not that none of this existed before, but even more now. Increased aggression, for example, against Vietnamese fishing boats, increased belligerence over the South China Sea, attempts to deny freedom of passage, even in international waters. And now, of course, the most recent move to completely subjugate Hong Kong and its pro-democracy movement to Beijing's dominance with this new national security law, which the Chinese Communist Party believes is worth the loss of economic benefits from Hong Kong, but in order to thoroughly and completely subjugate Hong Kong. And then, of course, what next? Look to Taiwan and increasing, ramping up of threats against Taiwan, which we are pledged, unlike with Hong Kong, we, the United States, are pledged to the defense of Taiwan in a mutual defense treaty. So what else has China been doing? It's important to understand what it's doing right now. It is trying to gain and then to consolidate its hold over the international supply chain of all manner of goods. Before Japan, the West, we, United States, others, adjust to bringing that manufacturing back home again, as many of our countries are certainly considering doing. And so what the Chinese are doing is producing and dumping cheap goods now quickly, fast as they can, so as not to lose market share after things shake out. In the context of this pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and the devastation it has wreaked in the West, especially, and the United States, the Communist Party of China also has seized a very quick, or attempted to seize, a propaganda advantage. Lying about the provenance of the virus, blaming the United States, blaming anybody except themselves, and buying up those PPEs, personal protective equipment. That means, you know, the gowns, the masks, the gloves, off the market. Now that was going on in the period before the world knew that the virus got out, meaning December, January. They were already doing that. They're still doing that. And then selling back to countries in a really tough situation with the virus, selling back defective equipment that they've produced. And then, of course, activation of the Communist Party of China's extensive network of operatives inside the United States with the intent to deny President Trump's re-election come November. Now, to sum up here, according to Steve Coughlin's paper and his calls for the Trump administration to form a red team, I think that's very necessary as urgently as possible. They need members on that team who understand what political warfare is, to assess not just the COVID-19 pandemic and the Chinese Communist Party's overall biological warfare program, which we must begin to speak about openly as much as is contained in the open literature. But we also have to ensure that this entire US failure to recognize China as an emerging challenge and a lethal threat to the entirety of the free world is corrected before it's too late. Now, I've named to you a number of books and their authors that I would recommend. Obviously, at Unconstrained Analytics, you've got Steve Coughlin, Rich Higgins. I will name also retired General Robert Spalding, and Steve Bannon, of course, Gordon Chang, Bill Gertz. There are others, and I'm sorry, I'm probably leaving out a whole host of names that should be included, but others will think of them to set up and to form, to assemble this red team as quickly as possible by the Trump administration. Finally, we must not, there's no need to buy into the Thucydides trap. If you've ever heard of that, what that means is that looking at the world a rising global power taking on a declining power is probably going to win. We don't have to accept that. If you posit that China, as it sees itself, is the rising power and the United States the declining power, and the West more generally. We have to stop pandering to what is in fact a very brittle, fragile system in China, led by the corrupt Chinese Communist Party, which is more afraid of its own people than anything else in the world. We have to know and have confidence that our system of individual liberty and the innovation spirit, the innovative spirit that it engenders, is always going to be better than a totalitarian, liberty-crushing regime like they've got in China. We must not wait for this pandemic to end. But I think, again, we need to assemble that red team on an urgent basis, because this isn't just about this pandemic or the biological warfare program, as I've said. It is about what I think, and others, Steve Bannon thinks, currently is the #1 most urgent, immediate threat to US national security, and that's Red China. Thank you everyone for being with me tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
That was brilliant.
Thank you.
No, seriously, personal belief, and also actual, someone just commented saying brilliant, and I agree, frightening. And I agree, every American has to hear this message. They should. So thank you. I have read one of the books that you mentioned, which is The Art of War, but the other two I haven't. So I guess I have some reading to do, and I think everybody should do some reading. And you're right, you know, COVID-19 lockdown, what better time to read? But I do want to quickly get to questions, because we have a lot of people who are asking. Claire, I'm going to start with the first question I'm going to ask you, is because more than one person asked, and I also want to know. So let's just start here. How could Dr. Falchi remain silent about his agency's grant for coronavirus grant research?
I guess that's referring to the Secretary General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, right?
No, both people asked about Dr. Falchi.
Right, but him remaining silent about
both the grant for the research.
Oh.
And also, why did he keep silent? Since I know, there's another part. Is why did he keep silence when he knew that respiratory disease is breaking out in Wuhan?
Well, I don't think he remained silent at all. I mean, he was beginning to give warnings way back in January, certainly the soonest that it was known that there was a virus circulating in Wuhan. I think neither he nor other senior public health officials in the United States at NIH, at the Centers for Disease Control, knew exactly what this was. Now, intelligence circles may have had a better idea, but that doesn't necessarily transfer over to public health officials. I think there's a dividing line there, that some know some things and others do not. I think that's part of the explanation. But I was getting to Dr. Tedros and the relationship between Dr. Falchi and Dr. Tedros at WHO that's been criticized quite a bit, and I think rightfully so. Of course, Dr. Tedros comes out of the Ethiopian Tigray, Tigers Liberation Movement, which is a communist organization in which Dr. Tedros was a member before moving on and up to the WHO. I think that at certain higher levels of world public health, there is maybe even a kind of a tunnel vision, or it is an intense focus on their own subject matter, in this case, virology, epidemiology, health concerns. And perhaps that is and not very good, but to the exclusion of some other considerations, like a globalist worldview, Weltanschauung, if you will. You know, the former activities of someone affiliated with a national or subnational, I guess I should say, communist guerrilla movement, as Dr. Tedros was. So, you know, without excusing any of that, I think there's an intense focus among fields that sometimes is to the exclusion of a broader view that some of us who are not, like me, not a world expert in virology, epidemiology, or anything medical, you know, I have the luxury of a more, you know, 20,000 foot strategic view, perhaps as a generalist, that they do not.
This question asks, President Trump seemed to be more aware of the China threat than any of our other leaders, but is Trump still behind the curve?
I don't think so. I think President Trump, and certainly I get this from some of his most recent comments to the media, to reporters, talking about not being happy with China, not wanting to talk to President Xi Jinping right now. He has said these things within the past week or so. I think he's very much aware, and aware not only of what we all see happening, but a whole lot more going on behind the scenes.
I agree. I have seen a little bit of change of behavior or attitude, I would say, in the briefings that I see as well. Questions are coming on both Q&A box and the comments. So I'm gonna ask one question from the comments. I'll do my best to pronounce all these correctly. It says, you mentioned China wants to take over the USA land, but what about Siberia? It makes sense for China demand Siberia. Hence, they have to have a chance to team up with Russia to take on China. What does Claire think about this scenario?
Certainly, Siberia, which is tremendously rich in natural resources. As a matter of fact, that's what I wrote my master's thesis about. It is an area that China has got to be looking at. And going back again into Chinese history, millennia past, we know that China had fought many, or warlords, Chinese warlords, maybe we should say, of petty kingdoms, had fought hundreds and hundreds of wars against the Manchus, against the Mongols. But certainly that area north of China in Siberia, that is Russia today, would be a tempting target for a regime that is talking about not just hegemony, global hegemony, but Lebensraum.
Okay, next question we have says, I have heard that COVID-19 is not deadly enough to be an effective bioweapon. So maybe it was just one of many they are working on, and they have a bigger one planned for later?
Well, I would suggest that a bioweapon is not necessarily intended only to be lethal. Now, as you probably know, in viruses, the rate of mortality or the lethality of the virus typically exists in inverse proportion to its communicability or transmissibility. And you can see why that would be so. If it were to kill the majority, or even like Ebola, a terribly high percentage of those it infects, it would quickly burn through any available population. But if it is very, very communicable, like this one is, it spreads, as this one has done, into a global pandemic, affecting, even if not killing, huge numbers of people. And again, the toll is measured not just in deaths, which are bad enough, but in disruption to the world economy. Now think how China thinks, how its leadership thinks. They want control of the world supply chain. They want to be the middle kingdom, the empire under the heavens, to which, connected perhaps by the Belt and Road Initiative, the String of Pearls ports, connected to everywhere else on earth that they can reach, such that the others will be economically less capable and will have to pay tribute to the emperor. This is how they conceive of themselves. They talk in these terms when not just among themselves, but sometimes quite publicly. So the purpose of a biological weapons agent is not just to kill, but thinking along the lines of Censor, of unrestricted warfare. It is to debilitate, to bring down, to destroy the economies and maybe the countries of the rest of the world, and especially the United States. Look at the toll it's taken on us. What do we have? Something like 40 million people unemployed right now? Our economy devastated? It's not just about deaths, although deaths come from shutdown and lockdown too, but it's about disruption, such that if China and the Communist Party of China is left standing, allowed to be left standing, they think that that is their way to domination, to hegemony.
Agreed, and they had impeccable timing right where our economy was at its best in almost forever. But here's another question somewhat close to what you were just explaining. It says social media platforms seem to be doing the bidding of China all the time. Are the Chinese agents that deeply infiltrated in these companies, or is it just because China is such a huge market for the companies?
Well, it's not only about the globalist worldview of some of these social media platforms, but it's also about, as the questioner there was getting at, the deep penetration of Chinese agents of influence into American society, academia, media. Online, we're talking about armies of bots, for example, as well as real people who are agents of influence for China. They are deeply embedded in the political system, in our electoral system. They have immense influence. There are some like Trevor Loudon who assert that in the 2018 midterm elections, it was Chinese communist operatives that helped to flip Virginia, my home state, to flip Virginia from red to blue by registering and influencing new voters. So yes to the question, deep, broad penetration through influence operations into American society in every sector you can think of.
And they're not alone. I'll say that because of the next question, which I'm sure you know, it becomes my favorite question. How do you view the Chinese communist force when it runs up against the Islamic force for world control?
Very interesting question. And this takes us back into history too, because as Chinese forces, if you'll include the Mongols, for example, moved west in conquest, I mean, all the way to Europe, to Western Europe, across the entire Eurasian landmass, conquering Baghdad, for example, and the Abbasid Empire there in 1258. Have I got that right? 1258. The Abbasid Empire in Baghdad fell to the Mongols. So there's been conflict and clashes over the centuries between the two. I think, and this is a really interesting area for myself, I think, in research. Obviously, the Chinese civilization, if we call it that, dates back much, much further, 5 millennia, perhaps, certainly at least 3,000 years back. While Islam, of course, dates, only until the 7th century. Now, they clashed, they met. I think that Islam took quite a bit from Chinese doctrine. And here's what I mean. The idea of the sole power, the sole Islamic state on earth, or the one and only Middle Kingdom empire under the heavens. The concept of the one and only dominant force of the entire world is common to both. The idea about land once conquered or occupied is forever belonging to that power, be it Islam or be it China. They hold the same view of that. Any land perhaps once conquered and then lost must be fought for until it's regained. That is common to both. The statement attributed to Muhammad, for example, in the Hadiths, war is deceit, absolutely straight out of Censor, right? War is about cunning and deceit and dissimulation and misleading the enemy. So I think there's been a fair amount of cross-fertilization, if you will, between these two. And currently, of course, the dividing line and the line of conflict runs through Western China in its westernmost province of Xinjiang, which borders on the Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, and was once part of a Turkic empire that stretched that far east back in the day. And currently, the Uyghur Muslims of Xinjiang, jihadis, want still to reestablish an Islamic state of those Central Asian republics, once Soviet republics, now independent countries, with what they call East Turkestan, or Xinjiang province of China. So you can see that the conflict, the line of conflict, is still there to this day. These are two very aggressive, expansionist powers, and it's not over yet.
I completely agree with that. Unfortunately, we are running really out of time. So just one more question, and that says, please repeat the name of Stephen Coughlin's website one more time.
Steve Coughlin's website is Unconstrained Analytics. I know it's a mouthful, but that's Steve, right? Unconstrainedanalytics.com.
Claire Lopes. Well, you already know I'm a big fan of yours, so thank you so much for giving us your time, giving us your amazing wisdom, and spending this time to give us what we needed to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie, and all the viewers tonight and who will watch later. Thank you very much.
Of course, if you could just tell all our audience, where do they go to learn more about your work and to support you and to follow you?
Well, I don't have a website yet. I am incorporated as Lopes Liberty, LLC in the state of Virginia. I am on Twitter in my own name, @Claire M. Lopes, on Facebook in my name as well. My works and videos are published at the Citizens Commission on National Security that I mentioned earlier. Also put up by The United West, Tom Trento's group. The United West. I blog at newsmax.com occasionally. And also I have been blogging on the Drudge Report under Laura Loomer, candidate for Congress in Southern Florida, at her blog site on the Drudge Report. So those are a few of the places. I also probably am going to begin soon again to put out my writing and so forth at Pundicity. You might know that's a place that publishes a lot of different authors and works, Pundicity. So those are just a few of the choices.
Well, fantastic. Thank you again, Claire, and hopefully we can have you back to give us some updates as far as Wuhan virus, COVID-19, coronavirus, Chinese virus. I don't even know what to call it at this point.
Be glad to come back, and thank you again.
And to our audience, everybody who was with us tonight, thank you so much. As always, we appreciate your support. We appreciate you showing up and letting us know that you want to learn. Please remember, these webinars are being brought to you for free by David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. So if you like to support these webinars to keep going, go to frontpagemag.com and consider making a 100% tax-deductible donation to help us continue doing these weekly webinars. With that being said, thank you again, stay safe, and we will see you next week. Goodbye.